My name is Elizabeth Moran. I'm the Water and Natural Resources Director for Environmental Advocates of New York. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and thank you for your leadership on the various water quality initiatives that were passed in the 2017 to 18 budget and legislative session. I'll aim to be brief, but yeah, I'll try my best. Nationwide, we are witnessing a renaissance in public awareness regarding the importance of protecting our water following the lead contamination crisis in Flint, Michigan. In New York, numerous communities have found themselves in situations that don't differ greatly from Flint. It's been 737 days, just over 2 years, since Hoosick Falls residents learned PFOA was in their drinking water. It's been 653 days since Petersburg residents learned PFOA was also in their drinking water. It's been 580 days since Newburgh declared a state of emergency because PFOS was discovered in their drinking water. All three communities still do not have any assurance that they will get permanent clean source water to provide their communities with drinking water for years to come, leaving many residents fearful about whether or not their water will make them sick. The extent of water contamination in New York has only continued to grow, with PFOA and PFOS discovered in Hampton Bays, 1,4-dioxane showing up in dozens of water supply systems on Long Island, and sewage discharges like the now infamous discharge in Niagara Falls making local and national news. In the face of this, New York has made tremendous progress regarding water policy in the past few years. But in the absence of a federal government that is willing to protect our environment, it will be crucial for New York to continue this progress. In the wake of the water contamination crises that are plaguing New York communities, New York must create and implement innovative policies and budget initiatives that prevent water contamination crises from happening to begin with by protecting water at source, replacing outdated and dangerous water infrastructure, and regulating currently unregulated chemicals. We must strongly regulate polluters and require rigorous testing. Our state agencies in charge of protecting public health and the environment must have additional resources to enforce and produce strong regulations. There also must be a regular water testing to make sure communities and the state can act fast in the face of contamination. And finally, we must create a uniform response for contamination crises. There must be policies in place that assure immediate response from state agencies and immediate notification of residents in the event of water contamination. The 2017 to 18 budget included several initiatives that have the potential to lead New York towards this path. As we enter the 2018 to 19 state budget and 2018 legislative session, programs created in the past budget will need to be built upon and grown to meet New York's growing needs. So this past year's budget was remarkable for water, with the creation of a $2.5 Clean Water Infrastructure Act, the Drinking Water Quality Council, and new requirements for emerging contaminant monitoring. However, the needs far exceed the funding that's been made available, and implementation of emerging contaminant monitoring has yet to take place. The Drinking Water Quality Council off to a promising start, but there's still a lot to do. As you heard earlier, each year of grant funding has been significantly oversubscribed and has led to an increased demand on New York's clean water and drinking water state revolving loan funds. The draft 2018 CWSRF IUP states that EFC anticipates that it will be able to provide 0% interest rate or low-cost financing for approximately $640 million of project's costs, which compromises about 19% of identified demand. Identified water infrastructure needs are enormous. You heard earlier today, it's been estimated that over the next 20 years, $36 billion will be needed to be invested in wastewater infrastructure and $38 billion for drinking water infrastructure. There's actually a funding gap that's been identified for sewering needs alone, and that's an $800 million funding cap. Thankfully, each year, New York has come closer to meeting this identified funding gap. So we urge the governor and the legislature to come together in the 2018 to 19 budget to ensure that the Water Infrastructure Improvement Act receives at least $800 million in funding. We clearly need a long-term and sustainable funding plan to finish the job. The payoff for investing in water infrastructure is abundantly clear. These investments mean New Yorkers will eventually be contending with fewer sewage overflows polluting their waters and water main breaks that lead to boil water advisories. These investments are also a shot in the arm for upstate economies. According to news releases from the governor's office, 14,190 jobs will be created across the state as a result of the most recent round of grant funding. The Water Infrastructure Improvement Act is a marker of true leadership and serves as a model that other states can follow. For this program to continue to be successful, we hope to see funding increase to at least $800 million this year. Emerging contaminant monitoring, the Drinking Water Quality Council. Water contamination is not limited to Hoosick Falls, nor is it limited to PFOA or PFS. However, there very well could be communities consuming water that has an emerging contaminant, but like Hoosick Falls and elsewhere, we don't know yet because testing hasn't happened. Because Newburgh has over 10,000 residents, they fall under the federal requirement for testing of chemicals listed on the UCMR. Thanks to this requirement, PFOS was discovered in their drinking water, and local government was able to act swiftly to the situation. Last year's emerging contaminant monitoring legislation sought to close this gap, which is why it's critical that at a minimum, the Department of Health should adopt regulations immediately through an emergency rulemaking to require all municipalities to test for chemicals listed on the UCMR 3. Recently, you heard that the department is looking to regulate PFOA, PFOS, and 1,4-dioxane by the end of 2018, and we feel that New Yorkers cannot wait that long. Additionally, the Department of Health should also revise their unspecified organic contaminating drinking water standard. It's currently set at 50,000 parts per trillion, which is an extremely dated value. And finally, we have some recommendations for the 2018 water policy agenda. This 2018 budget and 2018 legislative session must look to address gaps and needs that remain following the 2017-18 budget and previous legislative session. Environmental advocates urges the governor and the legislature to work together to provide $25 million in funding for Hoosick Falls to hook up to a new clean water source, such as the Tom Hannock Reservoir. $25 million is about what was estimated in some news sources. It's been 2 years since Hoosick Falls learned of their water contamination, but they still don't have a new drinking water source. They do, thankfully, have filtration systems, but residents do live in the fear that a filtration system could fail, and the community has been unable to escape the stigma of polluted water. This should be doable because there's a $100 million funding line within the Clean Water Infrastructure Act that, for projects that would ordinarily not qualify for state aid. We believe funding should be provided for Newburgh to remain in the Catskill Aqueduct. It was recently announced that they will be switched off of the Catskill Aqueduct in early January, back onto their polluted water source, Washington Lake. And unfortunately, the polluter responsible for Newburgh's PFOS pollution, the Department of Defense, has yet to agree to stop polluting, to clean up their pollution, or pay for the cost of their pollution. So until the Department of Defense stops polluting and there's a greater understanding of what's in Washington Lake, we feel that Newburgh should get to remain on the Catskill Aqueduct. We believe that there should be additional funding for DEC and DOH, and we believe that the 2018-19 budget should restore DEC staff levels to address the losses sustained at the agency and ensure the state's laws and protections can be fully enforced. Communities like Hoosick Falls and Newburgh are dependent upon a fully funded DEC to make sure there is adequate outreach in their communities and there are enough cops on the beat to enforce regulations. We believe that there should be legislation passed that requires testing for private wells. The governor's proposed budget for 2017 to 18 contained a proposal for private well testing, but unfortunately, that legislation did not make it into the final budget. While public water supplies are regularly tested for contaminants and toxins, and the results are sent to each ratepayer, private groundwater wells are not held to those standards, and as a result, homeowners have no assurances of their water quality. Last year's water quality hearings promised New Yorkers that this would get done, and we feel that 2018 is the year to do it. We feel that legislation should be passed that keeps dangerous chemicals out of our products. Right now, there are more than 80,000 unregulated chemicals that are on the market, and few have been independently tested for safety, and until recently, PFOA and PFOS were among them. This is a failure of state and federal authorities. Pharmaceuticals undergo intensive testing to determine health impacts before they receive approval from the FDA, but industrial chemicals can go right to market. We need legislation that prohibits dangerous chemicals from being used in our products. And finally, we believe legislation should be passed that gives all New Yorkers the right to clean air and water. Assembly Bill 6279, sponsored by you, Assemblyman Engelbright, and Senate Bill 5287, Senator Carlucci, is legislation that would do just that. Establishing a civil environmental right will drive better government decision-making at all levels to prevent situations or conditions in which land becomes too contaminated, water becomes too polluted, and air too dirty. People and private enterprises would also likely make better decisions based on a value set that all New Yorkers have environmental rights. In conclusion, New York has made laudable progress on water quality protections, but as we continue to contend with aging water infrastructure, continuing health threats in the form of emerging contaminants like PFOA and 1,4-dioxane and lead, and thousands of chemicals that remain unregulated, New York must continue to stand up as champions for water. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today, and thank you for continuing to show leadership on these issues.